Hey everybody, you're listening to episode 11 of From Guns to Keyboards. It's been a few weeks since our last episode. Quite a bit's happened, unsurprisingly. Starting with one of the biggest events that I think just completely captured the news cycle, which was the death of Raisi, the president of Iran. He, his foreign minister, and several other aides were in a helicopter on the border between Azerbaijan and Iran when, due to what appears to be human error, the helicopter went down and everybody on board was sadly killed. Meanwhile, the United States still working to create a diplomatic agreement between the Saudis and the Israelis. They appear to be very close. Now the pressure's on the Israelis to decide whether or not they're going to accept. Internationally speaking, the ICC has issued requests for warrants against Netanyahu, Gallant, along with several of the high-ranking Hamas commanders, Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, Mohammed Daif, and a few others. Additionally, internationally speaking, we have the Norwegians, Spanish, and Portuguese have unilaterally recognized the Palestinian State, with other countries expected to follow, including Belgium. Going to the domestic front, Israel has now expanding operations inside Rafah. At this point, they've conquered about they're in control of half of the Philadelphia corridor, along with working in several refugee camps, with expectations that the Israelis may expand to a full-on conquest of the city. And finally, some sadder news, as in within just a couple of hours ago, the families of several kidnapped female soldiers agreed to release the video of their daughters being taken from their base. It's a tough 3-minute watch. And as I was leaving the office, riding my bike here, there were massive protests on Copland, likely spurred on by these. Obviously, all of this overshadowing the fact that the negotiations, which were ended without any kind of agreement several weeks ago, have yet to restart. So, with all of that, where do you want to begin?
I think the headline that really unites all of the smaller headlines that we've been seeing over the past several weeks regarding Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the greater international community and its relationship with the conflict, the big headline that we can really state surrounding all of it is Israel isolated on the international stage. Whether it's regionally, whether it's at the UN, whether it's with what ought to be its best friend, the United States, Israel seems to be facing isolation from every corner. And I think the real question is, how far can Israel take this war without making a clear change in policy direction? Because until this point, while it has given up on some things, it has allowed for instance, more humanitarian aid to pass through Gaza than what it originally planned, owing to international pressure, while it has toned down the scale of the offensive in Rafah more than it had originally planned. We still haven't seen major changes on the Israeli side from a policy perspective, and the question is whether or not Israel is going to pull back on its war effort as a result of this major international isolation, or is it going to keep going strong and keep fighting this war until the very end, whenever that'll be?
So I think actually, to answer your question, we need to kind of even take it a step further back, because you know what, I agree with you in the sense that this to me feels like the lowest point in the war, aside from the days immediately after October 7th. I mean, Israel is completely alone in this. The entire world is very much turned against the state. The war is extremely unpopular internationally. The Israelis themselves are very divided, and there just seems to be no one in sight. So let's ask the deeper question of, why is Israel so isolated? What happened to bring us to this point?
I think it's a combination of really terrible public diplomacy on the Israeli part, which is nothing new. The Israelis have always been terrible at public diplomacy. And the basic fact on the ground that when you are the counterinsurgent fighting against an insurgency, you are not going to be looked upon in a grateful and appreciative manner by the international community, by the League of Nations. It will never, almost never be in your favor. And I think that the Israelis are, no matter what, I don't think there was any real way for the Israelis to go into this war without facing massive international blowback. I think that's something of a given owing to the very nature of this war. But I definitely think that Israel could have done a lot more to keep its international image stronger and maybe even push off the isolation that it's seeing to the degree that it's seeing today.
So honestly, I think Israel failed in two ways. I mean, I think aside from obviously the main failure of allowing October 7th to happen in the first place, Israel failed on a public outreach level, but also just on a policy level of fighting this war. In messaging, number one, I think Israel, it's been an absolute disaster. And then on top of that, just on a purely military policy perspective, Israel's failed. What I mean by that is essentially the Israeli IDF can go in and it can clear out neighborhoods and it can go street by street, house by house. And Israel just has superior firepower. It's going to win those fights. We've seen that if Israel wants to go into a place in Gaza and conquer it, it can do that. But then what it comes down to is, okay, what do you do now that you have it? At the end of the day, you then have to implement a policy that's going to ensure that after your soldiers leave, Hamas doesn't come back. And Israel is politically incapable of creating either alliances with the PA and allowing them to assert authority, or with alliances on the ground. We've already, I think one of our first episodes, you and I talked about the dream of having the international Arab states come in and occupying Gaza for us and administering, civil authority there. And a lot of the Arab states have said, the ones that even considered it have all said the same thing. We'll do so if Israel creates a path to a Palestinian state, which politically Israel's unable to do. At the end of the day, there is no one with an appetite for creating a Palestinian state. The Israelis look at it almost as, okay, so Hamas did this horrible act, killed over 1,000 Israelis, and now we're going to reward them with a state? Are you kidding me? It's a sentiment that I understand. At the end of the day, however, what are your other alternatives? This.
Yeah. Well, I think, one has to differentiate between the ultimate endgame that we want in Gaza and the messaging that needs to be brought about regarding that endgame, right? Israel can play a game here where it says, quite frankly, that it is going to continue to militarily control Gaza for an indefinite period of time to ensure that its civilians are not in harm's way. But on the messaging side, project a message of peace and desire for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the international community, meaning that Israel can, if it wants to, play both sides of the coin and basically say, we're going to, on the one hand, continue to fight this war in Gaza, while on the other hand, project messaging that is much more centered around bringing about peace, bringing about some sort of resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that even that messaging is currently not relevant for the Israeli government. Even if the Israeli government knew 100% that empty support for an Israeli-Palestinian peace accord would not ultimately lead to the creation of a Palestinian state, I don't even think that the Israeli government is willing to even make that statement to the international community. From their perspective, even uttering the very words is treason from the perspective from a lot of the ultra-right members of Israel's cabinet.
Absolutely. No, I don't think Israel even could consider saying that we'd be interested in a Palestinian state, that we want a long-term peace with a Palestinian state. They can't even go so far as to say that. And when you can't even do that, at the end of the day, the international community, I think, understands and recognizes that there is a real justice in the Palestinians wanting their own state. I mean, when we look at these people, they've been here for thousands of years. Many of them were actually once Jews who converted to Islam in one way or another. These people have been here in the Levant for thousands and thousands of years. They want their own state. And the fact the Israelis are coming in and refusing to grant it to them and using just the boot of military might to ensure that it never happens, the international community is noticing this. And it's isolating Israel. The fact that the Israelis can't even consider coordinating with the Palestinian Authority, a government organization that they themselves have helped prop up and have worked with in security matters for 20 years. Can't even consider them taking on Gaza because, I mean, and this really dives into the whole, cynical, conspiratorial / not conspiratorial, I would say, or rumors, let's say, of Bibi speaking to a closed Likud event and saying, anyone who does not want the creation of a Palestinian state supports Hamas. And we essentially control Hamas. We control the height of the flame. This is feeding very much into those rumors, into that, and it seems as though we're seeing that belief being played out in real time.
Yeah, and again, if we look at the basic policy of the question, there is a deep question that Israel has to ask itself and is asking itself, is it capable of living in peace side by side with the Palestinian state? And I think from a basic policy perspective, it is a fair question to ask and investigate whether or not a Palestinian state will pose a threat to Israeli security. We clearly saw that on October 7th, Hamas being in control of the Gaza Strip took advantage of that situation in order to carry out the largest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. So I'm not trying to say that these questions are unfair to be asked. All I'm trying to say is that Israel is not even at the point of I don't want to say lying. It's not even willing to be, at the most basic form, diplomatic with the international community and utter empty words of support for peace, because its ultra-right cabinet members are so radical that they would view any such wording as being completely unacceptable to them. And it brings me back to almost 20 years ago, to the beginning of Bibi's second term as prime minister. When Bibi comes to power around 2009, he comes back to power and he gave his famous Bar Ilan speech,
right,
where he proclaimed to the world that he wants to create a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and harmony with the state of Israel. Was that the truth or was it a lie? Honestly, that's a philosophical question. I don't really care to answer philosophical questions. I think there's a deeper diplomatic question of, was that the right diplomatic move to play at the time? Because there was no real policy substance behind that besides unlimited settlement freeze in the West Bank. And that clearly was a great policy and diplomatic move to make at the time, because Bibi wasn't giving up on anything. But he was showing to the international community that Israel's stance on peace is one that is acceptable to the community of nations and to the family of nations.
Absolutely, and it very much, at the time, it was a brilliant move because this was, Obama had just entered office. Reportedly, this is again even according to Bibi's autobiography, one of the first conversations they had was Obama telling Bibi, I expect there to be some kind of peace agreement coming forth. This is my big major policy in the Middle East, is moving the Israelis and Palestinians. Basically, I think he saw himself as the guy who could solve the Israel-Palestinian question. And when you have this young, incredibly popular president, and Bibi Netanyahu, who himself he had just come back from a major loss, now finding himself in the reins of power, it was if you consider it a cynical tactical move, it was correct and it was brilliant. Whether or not he actually meant those words at the time he was saying it, who knows? The only person who probably knows that is Bibi Netanyahu and maybe Sarah. But for the rest of us, it's only a matter of guessing. But yeah, you're right. The Israelis can't even go so far as something like that. Something that would benefit them diplomatically would bring the Arab world into this conflict on the side of the Israelis. And, we see that as well with the American-led Saudi agreement. The Saudis have lowered one of their barriers of entry into this agreement with the Israelis by saying that instead of Israel recognizing a Palestinian state, they just want a certifiable path to a Palestinian state. Again, something diplomatically friendly that's going to give the Saudis cover for aligning with the Israelis without the Israelis actually making any real concessions. It doesn't seem like the Israelis can even do that.
Yeah. Well, it's even important to mention that this is the second time the Saudis have come out from this demand. The original demand years ago was to create a Palestinian state, meaning the Saudis said, first create a Palestinian state and then we'll make an agreement. And then it said, fine, we'll recognize a Palestinian state or recognize that you want to create a Palestinian state and then we'll come to agreement. And now it's even lowering its standards further, which just goes to show that even from the Saudi perspective, they understand that either way, there's not going to be a Palestinian state likely to be established in the Middle East anytime in in the coming year, and maybe not even in the coming decade. Yeah. So from the Saudi perspective, what they're looking is for some diplomatic niceties coming from the Israelis to settle this out. And yeah, the Israelis are completely unwilling, and we're paying a price for this sort of approach to international politics. And we're seeing right now that the Israelis are currently expanding their operation in Rafah from what really started out as a limited raid in eastern Rafah to an operation that has led Israel to capture 70% of the Philadelphia corridor, which is basically the border between Egypt and Gaza. And the question is, can Israel get to the end of this operation without becoming a pariah state in the eyes of the international community?
Well, what does the end of the operation even look like? I mean, that's the million-dollar question. The Israelis can't even answer that for themselves. I think at the end of the day, if Israel had an exit plan, if Israel said this is what the end looks like, this is what we want, this is how we're going to get there, they would have a lot more leeway. But right now, it just looks like endless war, endless bombing, and people are tired of it. The international community is tired of it. The war is extremely unpopular. Biden is just a few months away from an election, basically funding a war that is extremely unpopular with the American people, and it doesn't look good. It doesn't look like the Israelis really have a lot of time left. One thing the Israelis are doing in response to all of this is they've started the manufacture of their own air-to-surface bombs, which is something that they had gotten exclusively from the Americans. Now that's being manufactured in Israel. In addition to moving other military manufacturing into Israel itself, it's only going to make the economic situation here worse, in my opinion, and possibly working with shoddier equipment. I mean, there's a reason why no military is self-sufficient from a logistical perspective. Everything comes from everywhere. And the Israelis simply doing that in order to continue this endless war, I think is going to make them a pariah state. I think Israel, the question isn't will Israel be a pariah state by the end of the war? I think it's more that Israel become a pariah state, and that will force the international community, or that will cause the international community to force Israel to end the war.
Now, here lies the question of whether or not the massive international pressure on Israel that we're seeing manifest itself in recognition of Palestinian State, in the warrants or the request for warrants for several of Israel's leaders, for many other actions carried out by the international community. I think there is a question here. Does this actually play out well in a certain degree for the Israeli government, that everybody's against Israel? Or is this going to actually cause real pressure that will lead to policy change? Because I, for example, look at these ICC arrest warrants being proposed to be handed down for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. And I think that the Prime Minister couldn't have asked for a better gift than these arrest warrants. This is perfect proof to the Israeli public, from the Prime Minister's perspective, and especially from the perspective of his supporters, that no matter what, the world is against us. The world will always hate the Jews. We're alone in the world. It reinforces this narrative of us alone against everybody else. And we have no other choice but to burn and destroy.
So you think that these arrest warrants are actually going to galvanize the Israelis around Netanyahu even further?
I think they've already galvanized around the Israeli leadership. I saw recently that Defense Minister Gallant went to speak to a bunch of combat soldiers in the Golani Brigade, and he referred to the arrest warrants being proposed against him and the Prime Minister as an attack on all the state of Israel and on the morality of the war itself, and on the moral ethics of democracies everywhere. I think that most Israelis, and with good reason, I don't really see any sort of legitimate reason why these warrants are being proposed. And I think also we saw that much of the international community, including the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, also referred to the ridiculousness of these warrants. But putting aside the fact that there is widespread criticism of these proposed warrants, I think that privately, Bibi couldn't have asked for a better outcome for his political situation right now. And we're also seeing that in the polls, of course I'm referring to polls that were released before the ICC
Right.
decision, so I can't claim that there's a connection between the two. But we're already seeing that Bibi is slowly making a comeback in the polls and chipping away from some of the support that originally went to his major opponent, Benny Gantz. And the more the international community plays into this narrative of everybody against the Jews and everybody against the Israelis and we're alone against the world, and this is just a repeat of the Holocaust all over again, the more support that Bibi's going to get.
Just reminds me of a rather megalomaniacal autocrat in history. The idea of like an attack on them is an attack on all. You know, it's the same kind of constant, the same kind of mentality. Quite frankly, for me, it's terrifying. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, we have seen the polls that Bibi has gone up. I mean, and I don't believe the ICC warrants are going to bring him down by any stretch of the imagination. We saw recently Gantz actually give an ultimatum to Bibi, and I think one of the reasons why you and I even forgot to mention it in our little news recap is because it's so inconsequential. Within an hour, Bibi basically rejected it. He didn't basically reject it. He flat out rejected Gantz's demand that Bibi propose an end game to the war. And Gantz is about to make himself politically irrelevant again, I feel. You know, at the end of the day, he should have, if he wanted to stay relevant, stay in the spotlight, rather than give the deadline to be June 6th, he said, okay, you make the plan right now, yes or no, we're doing this, or I'm out kind of thing. And that would have showed a lot of strength, a lot of leadership. Instead, he's giving Bibi 3 weeks to kind of wiggle his way out of this, to take control of the news cycle like he always does, and to play Gantz like a fiddle. And that also will lower, I think, Gantz's ratings in the polls and only increase his domestic support for Netanyahu.
Exactly. I think also Gantz made a major mistake that he waited so long. I think that most of the Israeli public supported Benny Gantz joining the coalition government and giving Bibi some sort of extra support as Israel went through perhaps the greatest crisis since its founding. But he definitely sat on his hands way too long when it came to sitting in the coalition. He probably should have made this ultimatum months ago, and now he's going to pay the price politically, as you said yourself.
He waited, and that's, I think, the question of the situation that we're in right now. Not discussing only the why, but what do we do now? And I think it doesn't matter what we do now. I think it's too little, too late. At the end of the day, the world is. I can't picture a scenario where the Israelis somehow bring the world back to their side. I mean, this video was released a few hours ago of the female soldiers getting kidnapped by the. That's the thing. Do we even use the word kidnap when referring to soldiers? I know this is kind of what I'm talking about a little bit too. Is that at the end of the day, look, the video is difficult to watch because these girls look so young. You know, they're 18 years old. We have to remember as well, they didn't do a school field trip to this army base. They live there. This was their job as soldiers. In this particular instance, Hamas was acting within the bounds of war. And as difficult as it is to watch or not, the base was conquered fair and square, and soldiers were captured fair and square. And yes, they then went on to, of course, massacre civilians and do a bunch of horrible atrocities that were not released. But this video, to me, feels like kind of a Hail Mary propaganda video to try and bring international support back to the side of the Israelis. And the only thing I believe it's going to do is just going to galvanize, I don't want to say call it the left, because there's really no left in Israel anymore, but I guess the center, the anti-Bibi center against Bibi even further, and just increase demands for hostages. And I think just try and put the focus within Israeli domestic politics back on the hostages.
Yeah.
Do we think it's going to have any effect on the government?
I don't think it's going to have a significant effect. I think that as tough as this video is to watch, the more you repeat the same terrible message over and over again, the more the listeners are desensitized to the message they're hearing. And I think that the Israeli public has become so desensitized to the horrors of October 7th and everything that happened afterwards that, and again, I'm not saying that we by any means have put this behind us. I think Israel is still going through a national trauma from October 7th that persists until today. But I think like any people, it found its way to figure out how to wake up in the morning and go back into the office and go back to work and carry on. And I think that the sort of nausea that most Israelis felt surrounding the hostage crisis, say 6 months ago, has dissipated to a very large degree. And while Israelis are, of course, still up in arms about the hostage situation, you don't see the same level of day-to-day conversation about it the way we did at the beginning of the war. And I think that this video, while I think you posted perfectly, is definitely something of a Hail Mary. Like many Hail Marys, I don't see it playing out too well for those who wanted to release it. And I say that with great sadness because we have approximately 130 hostages still being held in Gaza, separated from their families.
Yeah, I haven't seen home in 8 months.
And we don't see any end to this. I do want to say one thing, though, that in all these terrible things happening surrounding Israel's isolation, and, you and I are having a conversation as two people who care about this country and want to see Israel do better and be better and figuring out how it can kind of get out of this muck that it's in. There is one thing that I think is a positive point that has to be mentioned, which is the way in which Israel handled the operation in Eastern Rafah. I think that all the things that we've seen recently which has resulted in massive international isolation of Israel, the operation in Rafah, in my opinion, is perhaps one of the most successful military operations that Israel has carried out within the framework of this war. Israel went into the weeks leading up to this limited raid on Eastern Rafah, facing massive international pressure to not go into Rafah. If it does, it was told that there would be massive civilian casualties. The residents living in Rafah natively, and also those who fled to Rafah during the course of the war, would not have enough time to evacuate. There was all sorts of scary pictures being presented to the international community that tried to pressure Israel to not go about this invasion. And I think that Israel really beat those expectations in its limited operation, and I think it did it in a couple of ways. First, it carried out a very limited ground invasion at first, and it expanded upon that ground invasion in the days following, which basically led to a situation where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had the opportunity to evacuate Rafah.
The last numbers that I saw was actually 1 million Palestinians have evacuated Rafah.
1 million out of a post-October 7th population of 1.5 million, of 1.4 million that were crowded into the city as a safe haven during the war. And, Israel basically, because of the gradual nature of this operation, allowed Palestinians to have the opportunity to move north and seek shelter without facing immediate contact with the Israel Defense Forces. So I think some credit has to be given there. And I think the other side of things is the Americans and many in the international community were constantly repeating this estimate that it would take at least 4 months to fully evacuate Rafah. That's what the quote-unquote experts say on how much time it takes to evacuate a massive crowded city like Rafah. And within 2 weeks, 66% of the population has already moved north on their own account, beating all the international expectations. And we're seeing that these two results-based realities on the ground of both the gradual nature of the Israeli advance, which is making significant gains along the Philadelphia corridor and other areas of Rafah, and the fact that Palestinians have successfully been able to evacuate to safer parts of the Gaza Strip, beating all international estimates. I think these two things together have, I wouldn't say lowered Israeli isolation, but if I could say it in the opposite, prevented Israel from entering an even deeper level of isolation.
Prevented absolute isolation.
Right.
At this point. Yeah.
Right.
Prevented pariah state.
Prevented real pariah state situation, and I think that we've been even seeing that reports have been coming out where the United States has basically said to the Israelis that while this is not what we had anticipated or wanted for the operation in Rafah, we're largely okay with the way things are happening right now, and things seem to be happening on something of an even keel.
Yeah, absolutely. The Biden administration, the Americans themselves will continue to deliver weapons to the Israelis, which is something that they promised not to do if there were mass civilian casualties and if civilians were not being given proper time and ability to evacuate from Rafah. I do, however, want to take a step back and just caution ourselves before we consider any ongoing operation as either good or bad. I think until we have all the facts on the ground, until we really know what's happening, we can't really consider anything a success or not success until the day after, until there's been ample time to collect evidence and to understand, to hear narratives on both sides and understand really what happened. I use Al-Shifa as an example. I mean, Al-Shifa was lauded immediately by the IDF as being a successful limited operation in which there were no Palestinian civilian deaths and only 200 militants captured. And as time has gone on, we've seen that a lot of these so-called militants aren't actually militants, that there were civilian deaths, obviously. How could there not be in a crowded area around a hospital? And that the people who, and I include myself in this group, who immediately praised the Al-Shifa operation were caught with egg on their face. So I just want us to be very cautious when we're praising Rafah. I think initial signs seem positive. The Israelis are doing the responsible thing. They're doing the moral thing of allowing as many civilians as possible to escape before invading, and they seem to be going in a very roundabout way, not necessarily going straight down the middle. That being said, to me, none of this matters. To me, all I see are, I hate to say this, I see more dead Israeli kids. For what? Show me how this war ends. Show me what all this means, what all this matters. Because, look, yes, Hamas has had, by Israeli estimates, somewhere between 12 and 15,000 insurgents killed. By Hamas's own numbers, they say 6,000. So we can bet the numbers somewhere probably in the middle. Let's say 8 or 10,000. That is, from a purely military perspective, a huge success. However, reports are coming in from the ground that Hamas's ranks are being replenished. That at the end of the day, Palestinians living inside of Gaza are being led to understand that if you want your family to survive this war, you better join Hamas. Because if you want access to our tunnels and our safety network, and if you want to live with, in addition to everything else of living with the pride of the Palestinian people and all that, but if you just want, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, if you just want your family to have food and to have safety and have shelter, your best bet is to join Hamas.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the Gazans on the ground, I think, have come to accept and realize that there's going to be a day after this war, and Hamas is going to be the one in charge, and you better not get on their bad side.
Yeah. Yeah, and that definitely goes without saying, and this has been repeated quite frequently, even in Israeli media, that there is no plan for the day after. And, as much as I am excited about these operations that we're seeing in Rafah, and, maybe it's too early, maybe it's too late to talk about it, whichever way you put it, I definitely agree with you that the fundamental need of the Israelis right now, is to bring about a long-term diplomatic solution for the situation in the Gaza Strip. And I don't think these things are necessarily mutually exclusive. I do think that Israel has to, on the one hand, go down the military route of destroying Hamas's last brigade in the Gaza Strip, which is located in Rafah. That is something that Israel has to do.
But you really believe it's their last brigade?
I think it's their last centrally controlled brigade, meaning that Hamas probably has guerrilla fighters that consist of the size of a brigade or upwards of a brigade, separated into disparate guerrilla units throughout the Gaza Strip. But I don't think that they're controlled by a central command the way they are in Rafah. I think that Rafah is the last area where we're seeing any sort of military unit at the level of brigade left in Gaza. And we're seeing that there are other areas that do have centralized units, like in Deir el-Balach, where there's a couple of battalions still left there. But beyond that, we're not seeing that much centralized control. But I agree with the basic tenet of what you're saying, is that, like, at the end of the day, for every terrorist that we kill, they're just going to replenish their ranks tomorrow if we don't have a diplomatic solution. And I agree with you 100%. I think you're right. And I'm just trying to say that these things are mutually exclusive.
I got to push back against this whole idea. I know that's the sort of story we're being fed by the IDF. Like, the last brigades are in Rafah. I don't believe that for a second. We've already seen in northern Gaza, in the Zaytun and the Beit Hanun regions, where IDF forces re-entered, and they met fierce resistance. There were snipers, there were car bombs, there were home bombs, there were RPGs. There was a very coordinated effort against IDF forces there. It's just the way that Hamas fights now. At the beginning of the war, when you and I were still in the weeks after October 7th, when we invaded northern Gaza, there was a very coordinated attack, or a very coordinated defense, where you had upwards of platoon to company-sized Hamas units moving against IDF forces. And they were vastly annihilated by the superior firepower of the IDF. Hamas learned after the IDF just rolled through northern Gaza that, okay, they can't stand toe-to-toe against the IDF. And we remember even those early days of the war, like up through December even, you saw usually commando forces engaged in very close quarter gun battles with Hamas fighters. Hamas fighters would wait in buildings to ambush Israeli soldiers, and the Israelis would just pummel their way through them. What Hamas learned very quickly afterwards is that the best way to fight the Israelis is to just use long-range, hit-and-run, stay close to the tunnels kind of fighting. I recently watched a Hamas video of there was a tank at this, I believe, was in Rafah, although it might have been in the central corridor, but of two Hamas fighters in a tunnel. They get out, they take two anti-tank mines, sneak up to the tank, and you see in the video, in the GoPro video, there's an Israeli soldier with his back to them. Sneak up to the tank, plant the bombs on the weak points of the tank, pull the fuse, run back into the tunnel while a third guy shoots an RPG. These are the kind of attacks they're doing. They're incredibly sneaky. They're pop up out of nowhere. They utilize the tunnel system. They utilize the ruined homes, and it's very long range, hit and run kind of attacks. And these are the kind of, you don't need more than a few guys for these kind of attacks.
I agree with you, but again, I'm not saying that Hamas does not have manpower at the sides of a brigade. What I'm saying is that in terms of military units that function as a centralized brigade, we are not seeing that level of function in these guerrilla activities in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Meaning that, while you're 100% right in your description of the situation that Hamas is functioning as a disparate guerrilla army in areas of the Gaza Strip north of Rafah, this is not the function of a centralized brigade. This is the function of a disparate.
No, what I'm saying is they're not even trying to function as centralized brigades anymore because they don't need to. They don't need that centralized command. There are plenty of military units throughout history, and I include, by the way, the early Chinese Red Army, who worked in take a step further back. The Vietnamese Red Army, when they fought against first the French and the Americans, they didn't always fight under a centralized command. They had regional units that fought within that specific region. Yes, obviously, if you wanted to do a massive attack against, for instance, like in Bien Dien Phu against the French, yes, you're not going to get 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers without a centralized command. But that's not what Hamas is trying to do. Hamas has regional, and I don't think they're trying to build a centralized command of brigades. I don't think that matters to them. I think as long as they're able to just harass Israeli units, they're fine. They're content with that.
But I think that it's an interesting point you bring up because, maybe the Israelis were too quick to jump the gun in seeing this disparate guerrilla activity and saying that Hamas is completely decentralized.
Or thinking that matters.
Well, okay. Those are two different points. The first point you bring up is an interesting one, which I haven't heard, and I have to say I really appreciate the perspective where you're basically saying, if I understand you properly, that Hamas is functioning in a decentralized fashion, but this is coordinated by some sort of central leadership. If I understand you properly, meaning that even though we are seeing Hamas function as a guerrilla force, it's not as if Hamas does not have the ability to coordinate between these disparate guerrilla groups. They still are in some degree of coordination despite their decentralized.
No. I'm not saying that at all. I don't know whether or not that Yahya Sinwar is in direct communication with senior officers who are responsible for these certain regions. I'm saying that for Hamas, it doesn't matter anymore. They don't need to. They've completely reorganized and re-strategized. They now have regional units that can carry out attacks independent of a central command. Maybe, in terms of it, I would imagine they have some sort of connection because they're still able to get their hands on equipment, including, RPGs and snipers and ammunition and food and all these things that the soldiers need in order to function. But in terms of actually carrying out attacks, they have no need for a centralized command. They're a completely decentralized organization at this point.
I don't know if I fully agree with that perspective. I think that when we look at how this war started on October 7th, when Hamas sent 3,000 terrorists across the border in a highly centralized attack and carried out the worst mass murder of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, the threat to the state of Israel that was largely existential in the parts of Israel that were conquered on October 7th was unthinkable before October 7th, and it is unthinkable after October 7th. And the fact that Hamas has basically been forced down into being something of a disparate guerrilla force in the Gaza Strip prevents that threat from reemerging to a very large degree. When we are trying to keep the citizens of Israel safe from a threat of Hamas, it's not just the threat of disparate rocket fire from the Gaza Strip or disparate anti-tank fire from the Gaza Strip. The major threat from the Gaza Strip
is a centralized attack on the kibbutzim and the moshavim and the motzavim shel Tzahal that are all located on the border with the Gaza Strip. That's the major threat from the
right.
Gaza Strip.
And as long as Israel is inside of Gaza, that threat will not be able to materialize because Israel can disrupt any major Hamas activity.
Right.
However, throughout the courses of war, armies change. They adapt. You have to. If you want to survive, you have to adapt and remain flexible. And there's no military organization more flexible than an insurgent group.
I agree with you, but what I'm trying to say is that the fact that Hamas has been forced to adapt to this new situation is, in my opinion, a success for the Israelis, because the Israelis have basically eliminated.
But again, it's only as long as the Israelis are there. The minute the Israelis leave, the Hamas can reorganize. They can re-centralize. As long as the Israelis are continually pummeling them and showering them with airstrikes and having units go, neighborhood to neighborhood, of course, Hamas is going to have a much more difficult time creating a centralized organization. But when it comes to just harassing the Israelis and killing, 1 or 2 soldiers every day, which is what they've been doing, and it's that all they need is a decentralized command spread out into various regions that are able to operate and to see, okay, there's an IDF unit moving here, let's send these guys over here. So the small team in order to go strike them and take out either a tank or a tractor or a couple of soldiers. That's all they really need. The minute the Israelis are gone, Hamas is going to be able to reorganize and re-centralize.
You're 100% right, which is exactly why I don't think the Israelis are looking to leave anytime soon. I think that the Israelis are looking at the long-term plan for the Gaza Strip the way that it looks at the long-term plan for the West Bank, meaning that the future of these territories kind of divide themselves onto 2 separate tracks, where the first track is the civilian track, where Israel is not really interested in being the civilian government of the Gaza Strip and may or may not bring about a political solution for that civilian government, but that's a track that's kind of isolated and separated. And then there's a separate track of the military track, where Israel basically says, we are going to be the dominant and exclusive military force in the Gaza Strip. And you say, and rightfully so, that the only way the situation in the Gaza Strip can continue the way it does is if Israel continues to militarily rule Gaza. You're 100% right, which is exactly why I don't see Israel, at least in the next decade, leaving Gaza.
But this obviously brings us back to the whole Israel is now alone. Because at the end of the day, as long as there is a pragmatic, from a purely mechanical and pragmatic perspective, that's correct. The Israelis, as long as they remain in Gaza and as long as they remain fighting, they will prevent Hamas from ever becoming a centralized organization again that can create a legitimate or credible threat into Israeli proper. However, as long as they keep doing it, more civilians are going to die. It's going to look more and more like the Israelis are punishing the Palestinian people rather than attacking Hamas. And at the end of the day, Israel is going to eventually become isolated in a pariah state. Time is on Hamas's side. They know that. As long as they can just keep harassing Israeli troops and keep shooting out propaganda videos that, hey, we're still here and we're still fighting, so that, 1, they keep getting the international support, and 2, so that the Gazan people recognize who's in charge, then they win. And the Israelis can't be there forever. That's the thing. The Israelis cannot be there forever. There is a third option, I believe, which is that Israel can really utilize one of the best tools that it has, which is its intelligence abilities, which is its ability to infiltrate communities and have carry out operations that are almost impossible for most other intelligence organizations to do. We look back even half a decade ago, I believe it was. One of the leaders of Hamas was assassinated at point blank range. I mean, someone who knew him walked into his office and shot him at the behest of the Israelis. This is how good the Israelis can be when they want to. The problem is that ever since the mid-2010s, shortly after Bibi took power, he very much viewed Gaza as a military problem. This was not a problem for the intelligence and police. This is a military problem that demanded a military solution. And it's kind of that old cliche of when all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is how the Israelis have behaved in Gaza, and this is where it's gotten us. At the end of the day, there is a way to ensure that Hamas is never able to become centralized, and that's basically by doing what the Americans have been telling us to go back to do, which is go after the leadership. Stop playing at counterinsurgent warfare. We're not good at it. We're not capable of it. We don't have the manpower. We don't have the money. We don't even have the know-how. Nothing in Israeli military doctrine is about counterinsurgency. Everything is about major, large-scale kinetic warfare and conventional style warfare. None of our senior officers have really much training in counterinsurgency or understand the doctrine well enough to implement it on a field level, but we have intelligence agencies who are incredibly capable on these jobs, and they are, in my opinion, extremely not just in my opinion. After the October 7th, you had plenty of people within the intelligence agency come out and say, we have no human intelligence on the ground. When I got into the army, we would do closed-door meetings with the military intelligence, and they basically told us everything we thought we knew about Hamas before October 7th, gone. We're basically starting from scratch. Because Israel refused to utilize its intelligence capability inside of Gaza. And I think had they kept doing so, had they kept the pressure in that way, carrying out intelligence and assassination operations, I don't think you would have the same kind of centralized ability that Hamas has.
I'm going to push back on you a little bit there. I think that Israel, in parallel to the war effort, is carrying out a very significant intelligence effort, which plays out in not only the collection and analysis of intelligence, but also in targeted assassinations against Hamas's leadership as much as possible. I don't think that anybody is holding the harness back here on the intelligence community. I think that what we're seeing is the intelligence community not succeeding in reaching the sort of success that we expected from them during this war.
First of all, I don't mean to disrespect the intelligence community, just to be very clear. And second of all, I'm sure now the intelligence community, as you said, no one's holding the leash back. I'm talking in the decade, I would say, prior to October 7th.
Well, look, that's actually, I look at it a little bit differently. I think that in the decade prior to October 7th, I don't think it's that the intelligence community was pushed aside in favor of a military solution. I think the opposite. I think that the Israeli approach to Gaza was one of keep quiet, stay quiet. I don't think it was a military solution to Gaza. I think that Israel had this approach to Gaza where it said that if we have to enter rounds of fighting with Hamas, we do it because we have to bring back the situation as quickly as possible to the status quo. And it largely viewed the Hamas leadership as being one that will just continue to stay there. And maybe it was even convenient for the Israelis, for the Hamas leadership to continue to stay there and disparately rule the Gaza Strip separately from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So I don't think it was a military approach. I think that if Israel had a military approach to the Gazan problem, I don't think Israel would have been distributing Qatari money the way it did into the Gaza Strip in the years leading up to the war. I think Israel would have had a military approach of let's go in and use our intelligence capability to assassinate top Hamas leaders and at the same time start carrying out a massive counterinsurgency in the Gaza Strip. I think that Israel largely had zero strategy leading up to October 7th where it said we're just going to try to keep things on an even keel as much as possible and tried to push off the Gazan problem as much as it possibly
could.
Right,
and when I mean military approach, I mean
them in our face.
Absolutely. And when I mean military approach, I mean that every time the Hamas rockets started shooting, you just had airstrikes. 2014, you had ground invasion that killed something like 10,000 Palestinians in total. I'm not sure exactly the numbers there. I think it might have been a 1-for-1, but again, who knows? This was the solution. After 2014, after the discovery of this massive tunnel network, there wasn't this influx of okay, let's get back to doing what we do best with intelligence and assassinations. It was, all right, as you said, keep quiet, get quiet kind of thing. If you act up, we're sending in the Air Force, we're sending in the artillery, we're using tanks, we're gonna bombard the shit out of you and make you regret this.
And then a sudden conversation shift.
I love these.
You did mention in the beginning of our news recap the crash of an Iranian helicopter.
Oh, yeah.
And those who happened to be on board at the time of this crash included, among others, the president of Iran, the foreign minister, and several aides. The effects on the region of this crash are not entirely clear, and the circumstances behind this crash also aren't entirely clear. What are your initial takes on what happened?
So, I think, to be honest, a whole lot of nothing is going to happen. I do think it was human error. At the end of the day, I don't know if you saw the photos of the border between Iran and Azerbaijan, but it is mountainous. It is dense forest. It is, if for instance, if we suspect, I don't know if anybody suspects it, but if in the event somebody does suspect that there was a team on the ground with a rocket launcher, to know exactly what the helicopter's path was and to be in that path in a way that would allow you to hit the helicopter from within this densely wooded area, extremely difficult, borderline impossible without maybe a special trained U.S.-style special forces there. I think it was very much human error. I think at the end of the day, one of the problems of being Iran is that since being sanctioned since 1978, Iran's entire air force and almost all of its aerial equipment is Western made, and Iran is unable to get even basic parts in order to replace them. So as a result, you have F-16s that have been sitting in that country since the mid 1970s. That's the Iranian Air Force, and they're unable essentially to replace broken parts, to properly take care of them. And I think with these helicopters, it's the exact same fashion. The helicopters that Raisi was on it's no longer production by 1999. So you couldn't even make these helicopters anymore. I don't even think you could get parts for them, even if you wanted to. Combine that with the sanctions that Iran's under, they really can't service any of their aerial equipment. And so the idea that you tell me that's human error makes a lot of sense to me. As for what's going to happen next, look, the way that the Iranian elections tend to work, from my limited understanding of them, is that the Iranians go to the polls, and I believe they're going to go to the polls in 60 to 90 days. And ultimately, the Ayatollah makes a decision of who's going to be the next president. But it's a very good barometer for the Ayatollah to kind of understand how the people are feeling. So if this is kind of what happened also in 2012 or 2013, when President Rouhani was elected, and I believe it was 2013, it was very much an understanding of, this was a person who wanted to embrace the West and to want to begin peace negotiations with the West. And he was elected by the Iranian people, and this gave the Ayatollah the sort of understanding of, okay, this is something that the Iranian people are feeling and that we can potentially get behind, particularly with the overtures given by the Obama administration. Maybe something like that will happen now. I seriously doubt it. I think we're going to get someone similar to the former president in terms of ideology. But what's going to be interesting is that essentially this Raisi was being groomed, supposedly. And again, we're looking kind of into a black box here. But from what I understand from media reports, Raisi was being groomed to be the next Ayatollah. And so who will then take the Ayatollah's place? The man's 85 years old. It might be a very interesting game. I kind of wish I could be a little fly on the wall within the halls of Iranian power, because I think there's going to be a very interesting game of succession going on there as various political figures fight to be the ultimate kingmaker in Iranian politics.
Yeah.
But, that's just me. I also just love the show Succession. But what do you think about the death of Raisi and a potential future for the next Iranian president?
First of all, I think this is the third or fourth time that I've heard in recent years about some sort of helicopter crash killing either the head of state of a country or celebrities in the United States. So yeah, I think the first thing I've learned is helicopters and private planes are not the right way
I'll
to go.
I'll tell you what the lesson is. Helicopters and fog do not go well together.
Do not go well together?
Don't get into a helicopter if it's foggy.
Definitely not when you're flying over Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And I think second, obviously there's questions that one thinks about in terms of conspiracy theories surrounding this fall. I'm personally not a fan of conspiracy theories. I think that they're kind of a cheap way for people to easily explain very difficult situations. But one does have to ask the question as to whether or not there was any sort of plot behind this attack. And you did mention earlier that it seems to be somewhat impossible for a team on the ground to take down this helicopter, but there are other ways that one could try to sabotage a helicopter and cause a crash. And the question is definitely needs to be asked whether or not this was intentional in any degree. The Iranians have a lot of enemies, and those enemies are both international and domestic.
True.
And there's a question there of who might have brought about this attack. So if it wasn't in fact an attack, or I guess I should say who brought about this crash that led to the death of the Iranian president and the foreign minister.
The Iranians are not short of enemies. That is for certain.
The Iranians are definitely not short of enemies. Well, in any case, as we wrap up today's episode, we're continuing to stay hopeful that one day this war will come to an end with a fair solution to all, one that brings about a release of the hostages back to their homes, one that brings about an end to the fighting and peace in the Middle East, as much as we can possibly imagine this, what seems to be currently a unforeseeable future.
A high-minded ideal.
A high-minded ideal. And if I could be mildly belligerent in this very peaceful vision of a future world, hoping for the day in which the Hamas leadership reaches a President Raisi-style demise, one way or another.
I would love to wake up one day and see that Ismail Haniyeh was killed or captured. I think that would give a ton of international, or ton of, at least, I don't know about international, but at least domestic legitimacy to this. It would make so much of the fighting, so much of the death worth it in that sense. Would it bring about the end of the Hamas? That might be an episode for a different day. But in the meantime, stay hopeful, guys. Thank you so much for listening.